JD Vance mocked Jasmine Crockett for failing grade 2. Then America stood with her. Have you ever been judged for a number? A missed school year, a childhood mistake no one cared to understand. On live television during a nationally broadcast political show, a Republican senator delivered what he thought was a knockout blow, not about policy, but about second grade. You were held back, weren't you? He sneered. How can someone who couldn't pass second grade be trusted to write laws for this country? The studio went silent. But Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a laminated, yellowed piece of paper. She placed it gently near the microphone. A handwritten note came into focus. This child doesn't need a new school. She needs food. No words. Just truth. From that moment, the debate shifted away from academic credentials and political decorum. It became about something far more uncomfortable. What if we've been measuring the wrong things? And what if the children we label as failures were never slow, just hungry? The lights were harsh but familiar. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat beneath them, her hands folded neatly, her eyes calm. It wasn't her first time on a panel, but tonight felt different. The set belonged to Voice of Values, a primetime political broadcast, known for its no-holds-barred commentary and sharp ideological divisions. The guest opposite her was Senator JD Vance, a rising conservative figure whose debating style was surgical, sarcastic, and coldly effective. The topic on the agenda was supposed to be about academic standards and the future of education. But even before cameras rolled, Jasmine knew where it would go. It always did. JD Vance didn't wait long. 2 questions in, and he already veered off script. You were held back in second grade, weren't you? He asked. His voice was cool, not accusatory, but everyone knew the subtext. The studio tensed. The host, Carson Green, glanced at his cue cards, clearly not expecting the ambush. Jasmine didn't respond right away. She simply sat still, her body unmoving, her face unreadable. Behind the scenes, production assistants whispered into headsets. Viewers at home leaned closer. JD smiled faintly. I just think America deserves representatives who didn't fail the basics. That moment, broadcast live, sparked not just a conversation but a reckoning. And Jasmine, she did something no one saw coming. 20 minutes later, after fielding question after loaded question, she quietly reached into her leather bag. No dramatic gesture, no speech. Just a simple pull, a paper faded, laminated, and clearly old. She placed it beside the microphone. Then she looked directly into the camera. I've carried this for 25 years, she said softly. Not out of shame, out of memory. The host squinted at the sheet, trying to make out the handwriting. The camera operator zoomed in. There, written in pen in the corner of a teacher's comment box, this child doesn't need a new school, she needs food. Silence fell like a curtain. JD Vance looked momentarily disarmed, not by volume, but by vulnerability. And across America the clip began to spread. What followed wasn't a surge of applause or hashtags. It was something quieter but deeper. Teachers shared stories. Parents reflected. One woman wrote, I used to think kids who fell behind were lazy. Now, I wonder what I never saw in my own classroom. But to understand the weight of that night, you have to go back to a time long before Jasmine Crockett was a congresswoman. Back to when she was just Jasmine, a child, a second grader in South Dallas, hungry, tired, and invisible. She had never shared that year with anyone in politics. Why would she? In Washington, vulnerability was currency that rarely paid off. But she remembered it clearly, the chalkboard she could barely read because her eyes burned from fatigue, the way her stomach growled during spelling tests, the homework she never turned in, not because she didn't care, but because there was no light in her apartment that week. No hot meals, no working stove, sometimes no mother at home because her mother worked night shifts at a clinic across town. On some days, Jasmine would sit at her desk, pretending to write just so the teacher wouldn't ask questions. She learned to smile when hungry, to nod, when tired, to disappear in plain sight. The loud kids got detention, The smart kids got praise. The quiet ones got forgotten. No one had asked. Not once. So when JD brought it up like a punchline, Jasmine didn't fire back. She opened a chapter he never knew existed. Because the real story isn't about failing second grade. It's about how a system can fail a child so quietly that no one even notices, until she speaks. The next morning, the clip played on loop across news networks, social platforms, and classrooms. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real, unvarnished, unapologetic. And Jasmine wasn't trying to make anyone feel guilty. She was making them remember. Remember that not all children show pain the same way. Remember that silence isn't strength, it's often resignation. Remember that intelligence doesn't always come wrapped in perfect attendance. What if the kids we thought were broken just needed someone to ask a different question? That's where the story begins, not with applause, not with anger, but with a folder, a forgotten note, and a woman who finally decided it was time to be heard. Because the truth, she never failed second grade. The world failed to see her. The day after the broadcast, a shift began, not a tidal wave, but a quiet trembling beneath the surface of everyday America. The clip of Jasmine Crockett's calm moment holding up that laminated paper rippled across timelines and inboxes. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. In a classroom in Detroit, a teacher paused mid-lesson, pulled up the video, and played it for her fifth graders. No preamble, no context. Just the image of a congresswoman holding a line that read, "She needs food." Then the teacher asked, "How many of you have ever come to school hungry?" 4 hands went up. One child began to cry. In a living room in Boise, Idaho, a retired principal texted her former staff, "Do you remember that girl in 2008 who always slept during math? I think we owe her more than a referral to the nurse." Jasmine didn't post anything that day. She didn't speak to reporters. She didn't ride the wave. Instead, she spent the afternoon at a local school board meeting, listening to debates about standardized testing. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She had already said what needed to be said. Meanwhile, JD Vance faced a different kind of morning. Social media was relentless, not with insults, but with mirrors. Old footage resurfaced. A 2016 interview promoting his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, where he choked up discussing his own impoverished childhood. "I wasn't lazy," he said then. "I was hungry, and I didn't know if asking for food was something to be ashamed of." Now those words were everywhere next to Jasmine's. "I wasn't slow, I was hungry." The comparison was inescapable. By noon, a TikTok had gone viral. Side-by-side shots of JD and Jasmine, each with their quote, the caption, "What changed?" Because it wasn't the hunger. Back in the Capitol, Jasmine walked quietly through the hallways, folders in hand, nodding to staffers, ignoring the press gaggle camped outside her office. She wasn't here for a media moment. She had committee work. She had legislation to review. And yet everywhere she went, people looked up, not just at her, but at what she had made visible. A young intern from a rival party stopped her in the elevator. "My brother repeated third grade," he said, voice almost breaking. "We thought he was just behind. We didn't ask why. Not once." Jasmine nodded. "You still can." That elevator ride lasted 30 seconds, but it stayed with him all day. Across the country, things began to shift. Not from policy, but from presence. A mother in Arizona wrote to her school district, "Please don't punish my son for falling asleep again. Just ask if we paid our electric bill this week." A teacher in Mississippi rewrote her seating chart not by test scores, but by who always eats lunch last. And then as the story grew, so did the resistance. A far-right media outlet released a doctored version of the show. They added voiceover to Miss Ruth's phone call, implying she was an actress. The edit cut Jasmine's response mid-sentence, inserted sarcastic commentary, and ended with "Congress is not an orphanage. Stop voting by emotion." That clip went viral in certain corners of the internet. Within hours, harsh emotional manipulation began trending, but then something else happened. An independent fact-checker released a full timeline of the broadcast. Side-by-side comparisons, audio analysis, eyewitness accounts. It was undeniable the clip had been edited, fabricated, and not even skillfully. That thread was reposted by journalists, professors, even former Fox News anchors. The truth, once dismissed as too soft, had now become too strong to ignore. JD Vance made a short public statement. I respect Congresswoman Crockett's story, but personal history must never override national standards. The internet was less forgiving. One user wrote, "Didn't you write a whole memoir about your personal history to justify your worldview? Why can't she?" A conservative teacher from rural Tennessee who once supported JD posted a quiet photo, her classroom whiteboard. On it, "Ask before you judge. Hunger is not laziness." By the end of the week, something surprising happened. Not protests, not campaigns, just a wave of small actions. A middle school printed, "She wasn't slow, she was hungry," on the back of their lunch menus. A public librarian in Minnesota created a shelf. Stories we overlooked. On it, hillbilly elegy and letters from children in poverty sat side by side. Even Carson Green, the show's host, usually impenetrable, was seen stepping into a food bank the next day. No cameras, no announcements, just a quiet visit. 1 week ago, this was just another debate. Now it was a movement. And Jasmine, she never changed her voice. She never raised it. She simply told the truth. And truth, once spoken clearly enough, doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be heard. The following Monday, Congress convened for a routine education subcommittee hearing. The room was half full. Most members scribbled notes or checked phones. But when Jasmine Crockett entered, more heads turned than usual. Not because of a headline, but because of a story. She took her seat, placed her leather folder beside the microphone, and opened her notes. The faded laminated paper, now almost iconic, remained hidden inside. She didn't pull it out. She didn't need to. Across the aisle, JD Vance glanced up. There was no nod, no greeting, just silence. The chair called the session to order, but something had shifted. Not in protocol, in perception. A lobbyist whispered to an aide, "Do we have Crockett's talking points?" The aide replied, "It's not about talking points anymore. It's about tone." Outside the committee room, the nation continued to churn. A school district in North Carolina passed a new policy. Teachers were now required to ask students privately once a week if they had breakfast. A viral podcast episode titled "She Wasn't Slow" featured stories from adults who had once been held back in school. The most downloaded segment, a 90-second voice note from a woman named Ruth. "I was her tutor. I never forgot her." Jasmine didn't need more discipline. She needed someone to look her in the eye and say, "I see you." The clip was replayed across talk shows, parenting forums, and national radio. One segment even aired during morning announcements in a high school in New Jersey. "You are not your worst day," the principal said. And sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one who once whispered and was never heard. But the backlash wasn't done. An op-ed in a major conservative paper titled "Feelings Aren't Facts" attacked the growing wave of support for Jasmine as a cult of sentiment. "They don't want policy," the author wrote. "They want pity." The internet exploded again, not in defense, but with documentation. One thread now pinned to thousands of timelines began, "I'm a policy analyst. Here are 12 education reform bills Jasmine Crockett has co-sponsored, broken down by impact. Let's talk facts." Another post, simpler but more cutting, read, "They say it's pity. We say it's a promise." A coalition of educators responded with their own letter to the editor. "Emotion without action is empty, but action without empathy is blind." Congresswoman Crockett represents both. Meanwhile, JD Vance attempted to regain footing. At a press briefing, he shifted tone. "I've never said Congresswoman Crockett is unqualified. I question the message we send when we highlight struggle over success. But the question now was, what defines success?" A letter surfaced from a superintendent in Florida dated 2001. It noted a student, Jasmine C., had improved grades dramatically after being placed in a structured after-school feeding program. The note ended, "When students are nourished, they thrive. We must stop mistaking fatigue for failure." The cultural moment stretched beyond politics. A playwright announced a one-act show titled Second Grade, inspired by the Crockett-Vance exchange. An independent coffee shop in Oregon started offering a Crockett breakfast-free oatmeal and fruit to any child accompanied by a guardian before 9 a.m. Even a national food chain quietly launched a campaign, "No one asks why, we do." Their tagline, "She wasn't slow, Jasmine remained mostly quiet through it all. She issued no new statements, attended every session, spoke when needed, voted as always. But then she made one move. She submitted a bill, titled the Equity Readiness Act, focus mandatory school meals for all children in public education, funded in part by reallocating unused administrative surplus funds. But buried in the bill was a clause: all public schools must provide confidential weekly wellness checks for students in grades K-3. That clause, it carried the spirit of the paper she once held up. And the debate that followed wasn't just about money, it was about meaning. The chair of the Education Committee asked, "Are we making schools therapists?" Jasmine replied calmly, "No, we're making them humane." The room paused. The bill passed committee by one vote. And so began the next ripple. Her staff received letters from parents, teachers, and former students. One was from a man who had never voted before. "I watched you on that show. I've been ashamed of repeating third grade my whole life. That night I told my daughter the truth, and we cried together. Thank you." Another came from a teacher in Oklahoma. "I've started leaving granola bars in my desk. I don't ask why anymore. I just say, take one if you need it. It's a small act, but maybe it's a start." The letters kept coming. Jasmine read each one, and in the quiet of her office she whispered, "They're starting to ask." Tuesday morning. Overcast skies hung low over Washington, D.C., but inside the House chamber, something felt newly illuminated. The walls echoed less with argument and more with thought. The Equity Readiness Act had stirred emotions on both sides of the aisle. Not for its scope, it was modest compared to sweeping reforms, but for its soul. The clause about wellness checks had touched a raw nerve. Jasmine entered the chamber in a slate-gray blazer, simple, crisp. The laminated paper was with her as always, tucked into the inner pocket like a steady pulse. Today she wasn't expected to speak. She was expected to listen, and she did, for over 2 hours. But as one representative began reading aloud another critique, questioning if hunger stories were a tactic rather than testimony, Jasmine's hand moved not quickly but deliberately. She reached into her blazer. The paper emerged. She didn't hold it up. She laid it flat on the table, visible to no one but herself. Then she spoke, quietly but clearly. "People often say, 'Your story is touching, but it's not legislation.' They're right. The story isn't. But what the story shows, that's the legislation." She paused. No rustling papers, no shifting chairs, just listening. "If you believe this is just about food, you've missed the point. If you believe this is just about school, you've missed the point. If you believe this is about one girl who repeated second grade, you've missed everything." The room was still. Then one hand went up. It belonged to Representative Elena Morris, a centrist from Ohio. Rarely vocal, always analytical. She adjusted her glasses and spoke into the mic. "I was one of those who thought Crockett's moment was just a media flash. But my son, he's in third grade, asked me last night, 'Mom, why didn't anyone help her?' And I had no answer. I don't want to face that silence again." Another voice joined, this time from the right. Congressman Lowell, a staunch fiscal conservative. "I'm not changing my vote," he began, "but I will say this. I used to think stories were distractions. But maybe we've underestimated what they reveal." Jasmine didn't reply. She simply nodded. Outside the chamber, something unexpected happened. Volunteers without fanfare began setting up tables across school districts nationwide, offering morning snacks funded by local donations. A librarian in Arizona placed a small basket labeled "Focus First" at the front desk with granola bars. A movement had begun, not driven by party but by purpose. Meanwhile, back in Washington, political strategists on both sides were baffled. How had a moment so quiet become so loud? The answer wasn't in Crockett's voice. It was in what she refused to do. She didn't grandstand. She didn't weep. She didn't shout. She simply remembered, and made others do the same. When the bill finally came to a floor vote, the cameras were ready. Jasmine arrived early, not to prepare a speech, but to be present. A few representatives gave expected remarks, some in favor, others against. Then an unexpected request. Congressman Harold Guffey, who had previously criticized Jasmine, asked to yield his time to her. It stunned the room. Jasmine stood. The laminated paper stayed in her hands, but this time it remained folded. She looked around. Then she said, "You don't have to vote for me, but please vote for the child in your district who didn't eat this morning." No dramatics, just truth. And in that moment, even those who opposed her felt the weight of what she carried not in paper but in presence. The Equity Readiness Act passed the House floor with a narrow but meaningful margin, 227 to 204. It was a win, but not a sweeping one. For Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't about numbers. It was about names, children she had never met but had spoken for. Yet the moment of hope was brief, because with victory came venom. Within 24 hours of the vote opposition, media outlets launched campaigns branding the act as soft policy. Headlines screamed, "Congress caves to tears, emotion over efficiency, and the rise of the pity politic." Cable news segments featured panelists scoffing at the paper Jasmine held. "We are writing laws based on sob stories," now said one host. What's next? Legislative decisions from diary entries. Online forums, especially those frequented by political purists, turned the laminated paper into a meme. It was photoshopped onto cereal boxes, mocked as the Tissue Act, and accompanied by captions like, "This is not governance." But beneath the satire, something deeper stirred. A group of teachers posted a video compilation children explaining why they struggled in school because of hunger, home instability, silent trauma. The clips were raw, often just a few seconds long. One boy said, "I didn't do my homework because my sister cried all night and I had to hold her." Another barely audible, "We didn't have lights last week." The hashtag "Listen Before You Label" trended. Back in D.C., Jasmine didn't respond immediately, but her team prepared a report. 26 pages long, dense with data, it showed that schools implementing morning check-ins saw a 14% increase in attendance, a 9% improvement in early literacy, and a 17% drop in disciplinary action. She hand-delivered it to every member who voted against the bill. No cover letter, just a sticky note. These are not sob stories, they are early interventions. The public reaction began to split. Some claimed Jasmine was manipulating narratives, trading facts for feelings. Others argued she was the only one grounding legislation in lived experience. Then came a turning point. A conservative congressman from Texas, known for strict education stances, shared a tweet. "My daughter just asked why we don't do breakfast checks at her school. I had no answer. Maybe I need one." The post wasn't long, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And it was retweeted 240,000 times. Meanwhile, in a suburb outside of Denver, a school principal decided to pilot the policy without waiting for federal funding. She redirected budget from a less-used technology upgrade. "We'll fix tablets later. Right now, we fix mornings." 3 weeks into the trial, she wrote a public letter. "One of our students who used to fall asleep in math is now wide awake. He eats, he smiles. He asked his teacher yesterday, 'Is this what second grade is supposed to feel like?'" Jasmine Crockett kept moving, quietly, steadily. She visited schools not with press, but with notebooks, sat in on morning routines, asked questions, took notes, watched as tiny changes echoed large truths. A janitor in Michigan told her, "We don't need magic. We need people who remember what it felt like to be forgotten." Then another challenge arrived. A coalition of lawmakers filed a motion to review the Equity Readiness Act in the Senate, with new stipulations limits on funding, removal of the wellness clause, and mandatory academic metrics. Jasmine stood on the Capitol steps, flanked by teachers and pediatricians. "We are not measuring feelings. We are creating the conditions in which achievement becomes possible. Hunger isn't anecdotal, it's statistical." The speech aired live. But more than views, it sparked a shift in how people spoke about childhood. Education forums changed titles from learning outcomes to learning readiness. Parents started asking, "Did you eat?" before asking, "Did you pass?" The Senate vote was approaching. JD Vance remained largely quiet. He had not withdrawn his opposition, but he also hadn't reignited his rhetoric. When asked by reporters if he still believed Jasmine's story was an emotional ploy, he replied, "The vote will speak for itself." And it did. The Senate passed the revised Equity Readiness Act, 5248. Jasmine sat alone in the gallery, paper in hand. She didn't smile. She didn't weep, she just nodded. Outside reporters gathered. A child 10 years old there with his mother held up a sign. She wasn't slow, she was hungry, so was I. And in that sign, more than in any poll, the impact was clear. A week after the bill's passage, a small ceremony was held at a public school in Garland, Texas. No television crews, no podium, no applause. Just a gathering of educators, students, and one elderly woman holding a worn tote bag. It was Miss Ruth. She had been invited by the school board to speak to young teachers. Not about policy, but about presence. Her voice cracked as she told the story of the girl who once sat quietly in the back row, too tired to read, too proud to ask for help. That girl, she said, taught me the difference between teaching and noticing. In the front row, a new teacher scribbled notes furiously. On her notepad, one line stood out, "Don't just teach, notice." Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett returned to work as usual. She declined interviews, refused book offers, ignored profile requests. Her staff said she wasn't interested in fame. She was interested in follow-through. That's why 3 weeks later, she co-authored a bipartisan proposal to study the link between nutrition and behavioral referrals in early education. It had no sweeping title, just H.R. 1198 Child Readiness Data Collection Act. One journalist asked, "Are you trying to keep the momentum going?" Jasmine smiled, "I'm trying to make sure it wasn't a moment." The cultural conversation began to settle, but its aftershocks didn't fade. Public schools across 11 states reported a surge in parent-teacher communication. Thousands of breakfast programs saw increased attendance. A district in Minnesota even installed listening corners, places where students could quietly report their needs without stigma. In New York, a mural appeared outside a middle school, a child handing a lunchbox to another child with the words, "She wasn't slow," painted above. No artist took credit. It just appeared as if to say, the message belongs to everyone. JD Vance did not revisit the debate publicly, but in a rare floor speech on education policy, he remarked, "We must begin considering the context in which children are expected to succeed." Some called it a shift, others called it politics. Jasmine called it enough. One final scene unfolded a month later. A second-grade class in Oklahoma was asked to write letters to people they admired. One child wrote, "Dear Jasmine, thank you for showing that people can get better at school. I didn't think I was smart, but my teacher said, 'You're just hungry like Jasmine was.' Now I eat every day and read every day." From a kid who thought he was dumb, but now knows he's not. The teacher mailed it to Jasmine's office. It never made the news. But she kept it in the same pocket as the old laminated sheet. Some papers, it turns out, are worth keeping. If this story moved, you don't let it stop here. Subscribe to our channel to follow voices that often go unheard. Leave a comment sharing your own story or someone who helped you feel seen. And hit like if you believe that behind every forgotten child is a truth worth telling. Together, let's make sure no one's hunger of food, of care, of dignity is ever dismissed again.